Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session on assessing the effectiveness of protected and conserved areas and systems. So my name is Isidoro Hasman, and I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. We're grateful for everyone joining us today. This session, as you might be aware, is part of the High Ambition Coalition for Nature's and People's ongoing effort to support members as they move from ambition to implementation of Target 3 and the 30 by 30 agenda. Part of the capacity building portfolio, today's session is designed as a technical exchange, but also as a space for reflection. We're especially pleased to be joined by an excellent group of speakers and partners. Paola Mejía Cortez, Nick Salafsky join us from FOS and their work at the IUCN WCPA Effectiveness Task Force. They will introduce the outcomes-based approach for addressing the effectiveness of protected and conserved areas and systems. And we will also hear country perspectives, as Paula will introduce them, from Marta Díaz of Parques Nacionales Naturales de Colombia and Edgar Eduardo Vicuña Miñano from Peru Cernam. Their contributions, of course, are especially important, part of which they are Colombia and Peru are also invaluable members of the High Ambition Coalition. So thank you all four for partnering with us and sharing your experience with the HAC community overall. So before we begin, a few housekeeping options. We have, if possible, please update your Zoom name to include your country/organization. So just for example, I have in my, I've renamed myself Hack for an MP. It'd be greatly appreciated as we're recording this and we want to send out follow-up after the session ends. Of course, the session is being recorded and there is interpretation available for everyone. You can click on the ellipsis on the bottom right and select your interpretation language output, whether it's English, French, or Spanish. Today's speakers, many of which will be speaking Spanish. So again, select your language of output and it'll come out as English, French, or Spanish. Please let me know if there are any issues with the translation, and I'll be troubleshooting those as the session goes on. And we welcome questions throughout the session. Please use the Q&A function whenever possible. And also, we will be collecting these questions and returning to as many as we can during the discussion portion. So again, we're halfway to the 30 by 30 Target 3, and we are now looking at implementation. The visual is a useful reminder, and that it's not just about areas themselves, but how they're managed, whether they're part of a well-connected system, whether they're delivering durable outcomes for biodiversity, ecosystem functions, services, and peoples. We should not be reading this only as a race towards a percentage. The central question is what lies behind them. Are the areas being counted? Are they being achieving these conservation objectives? Are they supported by the right governance, financing, management capacity, and monitoring? Are they connected in ways that sustain biodiversity across landscapes, seascapes? Are the countries able to use information on effectiveness to make better decisions? So this is the reason for today's conversation. We need approaches that help move the discussion beyond counting areas toward understanding outcomes, identifying gaps, and improving management at both the level of individual sites and wider systems and the polity and ministerial level. This is also why an outcome-based perspective matters. Effective planning, governance, and staffing and implementation matter greatly, especially when countries are working under real constraints. But ultimately, those processes need to be connected to credible objectives, evidence, learning, and adaptation. So a little bit of overarching stage setting of where we are at the hack. Today's, as you can see on the map on screen, the hack has 4 pillars in terms of our TACB. And in particular, we're now leading towards implementation of Target 3. And this is where the skill building pillar becomes especially important, such as regional workshops, applied exchanges, and advanced trainings. If you have been following the hack, we had a sustainable finance advanced training at the end of last year. And this certainly echoes what we're doing here. We're trying to connect practitioners, hack members with more of the technical framing, and not just one session, but continuously increasing learning opportunities for the hack community overall. So this is part of a larger learning pathway of the TACB, and it's more than just sharing information. I hope that with this great engagement, this great event with amazing speakers that we have on hand, members can identify questions they need to ask, the kinds of data or dialogue that may be missing, and areas in which a peer exchange or targeted technical partnership could be of real value. So with that in mind, I would like to briefly return to today's speakers. Paola, Mejía, Cortez, and Nick Salafsky will guide us through the effectiveness framework. And then we'll hear from Marta Diaz and Edgar Eduardo Vicuña Miñano, whose country perspectives will help ground the discussion in the realities of national implementation. So with that in mind, we hope that this session will help open questions, try to resolve them as well. And Paola, or Nick, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Isidoro. Appreciate the introduction, and Paola and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with your group here. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to go through our presentation. So this is an outcomes-based approach for assessing the effectiveness of protected and conserved areas, but also protected and conserved area systems. And so we'll be talking about both of those things today. Our aims for today's meeting are to introduce the effectiveness framework that we've been working on, to talk about how we could extend this framework to protected and conserved area systems, to provide a country perspective. So we have folks from Colombia and Peru who are going to share their perspective on this work. We're also going to introduce system dashboards, and we're joined by one more Foundations of Success colleague, Xavi Excute, who's going to talk about some dashboard work we've been working on. And then we're going to discuss potential next steps to develop an application of this work to protect and conserved area systems. So you can see the agenda on the right. We'll do a bit of the welcome we've already done. We'll present for about 60 minutes, the framework, and then we'll have 20 minutes for discussion and next steps. So let's start with the first part, an effectiveness framework for protected and conserved areas. So you all are familiar with Target 3, and Target 3 says that we want to have this ambitious goal of 30% of the world's waters and lands protected. But the highlighted part is the particularly key part, are effectively conserved and managed. So as Isidoro said, it's not just about quantity, but it's also about quality. And so how do we agree on what do we mean by effectiveness and to improve management? About 4 years ago, Paola and myself were commissioned by Madhu Rao, who was the head of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas. And she said, "What we would like you to help us think through, how can we come to do better thinking about outcomes when we assess effectiveness?" And so we convened a task force, and that task force worked over 4 years. Paul and I also represent Foundations of Success, which is a not-for-profit organization. Our mission is to amplify the impact of the global conservation community. We have branches in North America, Latin America, Europe, and Southern Africa. We provide training and coaching. We develop frameworks and tools. We facilitate collaborative learning, and we build capacity for the future. Our sort of unofficial tagline is that we don't actually implement conservation work, but we make other people's work better. We're also part of a broader group called the Conservation Measures Partnership, or CMP. CMP is a consortium of different organizations that are interested in improving how conservation gets done. And CMP provides best practices through something called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation. So way back in 2004, we produced version 1 of these conservation standards. We then produced version 2, version 3, version 4, and we've just released version 5. And what these are a set of best practices and principles for doing conservation work in general, but of course it also applies to protected and conserved areas. And the reason this is important is that if you look at the world of protected areas, there's been a whole group of people who are climbing the mountain of effectiveness who come from the WCPA and from the HAC and various groups who are working at the international level. And then there's been a whole group of people working on the Conservation Measures Partnership climbing that same mountain. And what we're really trying to do is bring together the learning and experiences of both of those groups together. And what was really interesting is there were some groups, particularly some conservation or protected area systems in Latin America, part of the Red Parka system, who are already at the top of the mountain and bringing those two groups together. And you'll hear from some of them today. So what our task force did is we set out to first say, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but that there's a lot of work that's already been done on assessing effectiveness of protected areas. And so the very first thing we did was what we call a Rosetta Stone analysis, where we said, let's look at all those existing frameworks and tools. And so for us, a framework might be something like the original PAME framework that was developed in early 2000. That framework led to an effectiveness assessment tool, for example, the MET. More recently, there's been the Green List standard that IUCN developed, which is a framework for thinking about effectiveness of protected areas. And there's a self-assessment tool now that is being developed as part of that thing to help implement that framework. Of course, many countries have their own versions of these frameworks and tools that they use for their management. And then you can think about the conservation standards. It's both a framework and it comes with a set of tools for doing and implementing it as well. So there's a lot of existing thinking and learning that's been out there. So what we did is we took all those existing frameworks and tools and we looked at how they define and think about effectiveness. First, in their original order, what do they actually say that you need to measure or look at? And then we compared them to each other to see where there were similarities and when there were gaps. And what were the common principles and ideas that emerged from looking at all those different frameworks and tools? Based on that, we first came up then with some principles about what it takes to think about effectiveness. So the first principle that I want to share with you is that a good effectiveness framework needs to be thought about at both an individual area and a network level. So of course, what we mean by an individual area would be a protected area, maybe on land, maybe in water, but it's an area that's defined. That area has a team that is managing it. That area is going to pick in the green circles the values that it cares about. So maybe natural values like jaguars or a forest ecosystem. And that team is going to be implementing one or more strategies to help manage and protect and conserve those values that we care about. So there's strategies that you're going to be implementing along a theory of change. Of course, it's not just natural values. There also might be human well-being values or cultural values that are also important to those protected areas. So we need to define what that protected area is trying to do. You will notice that we are using the word protected and conserved area, or PCA. By that, we mean both traditional protected areas, but we also mean OECMs. And more recently, we've actually been doing some work with the World Bank and GEF to really see does this framework also apply to OECMs? And the good news is it pretty much does. So what we're able to do is when I say PCA, I mean both traditional protected areas, but also additional conserved areas or OECMs. So we need to think about effectiveness at the level of that one area. But of course, and of interest to the folks on this call, we also need to think about doing this not just at the level of one area, but the collection of areas that are found in a network of protected areas. And that network of areas is typically managed by a protected or conserved area system. So you're going to have a system team that is charged with managing that network, and they may have values and strategies that they're trying to implement at the system level. And so we're going to think both at the level of the individual protected and conserved area, but also at the system level. All right. Our second principle is that if we want to think about effectiveness, we have to think about both process and outcomes. And I'm going to give you an analogy to talk about this. So imagine that there are two teams that are rowing, and rowers face backwards, so they're facing backwards. But these teams are racing side by side on two pieces of water. And at the start, they're both at the start. The gun goes off, the teams start rowing, and after a while, Team A has crossed the finish line and achieved the conservation outcome, and Team B is way back here and is still rowing like mad back here. And I'm going to ask you a question, which is, which team has been effective? And so obviously, Team A has crossed the finish line and achieved their conservation outcome, so they should get the green check mark. And Team B has not achieved their conservation outcome. So maybe we would not give them the green check mark, and maybe they're going to need some assistance or support. But you know it's a slightly trick question. And here's the trick to the question. If I gave you a little bit more information and I told you that Team A had a current of enabling conditions that was pushing them along, so all they had to do was sit there and they just drifted over the finish line, and Team B is rowing like mad in the face of huge threats that they have to overcome. And without all their work, they would be 10 kilometers further to the left because of the current. And then I ask you which team has been effective, and it's not so clear because Team B should get credit for the process that they're going through and their short-term outcomes. And so what this teaches us is that we have to think about effectiveness. Yes, it's about the ultimate outcomes, but it's also about what you're doing to get there and the context in which you are working. So what we've learned as our third principle is that if you want to talk about being effective, what we really have to do is set credible and smart objectives and outcomes. So that if you are asking, is my protected area or conserved area effective? The first question is, what are you trying to accomplish? And so we need people to set the bar for what you need to achieve. That bar must be determined by the area or network managers during the planning process. And it represents what you need to accomplish to conserve the values that you care about. Now, it has to be credible. You can't just set the bar too low and then hop over it and say, hey, woohoo, we're successful. So it's not credible if you don't set the bar high enough. But at the same time, you also can't set the bar way too high. So for example, in the case of climate change, if you say we're going to stop climate change, that's not realistic. That's setting the bar too high, and that's never going to lead to effectiveness either. So what you need to do is you need to set the bar to be results-oriented, which is high enough to matter, but it also has to be achievable, which is low enough to be feasible. And then it also has to be specific, measurable, and time limited so that it can be easily assessed. So that's the genesis of having a SMART, if you've heard that acronym, objective or outcome. It's specific, measurable, achievable, results-oriented, and time limited. And that's why we want these objectives to be SMART. But here's the thing. It's actually not one bar. It's actually a set of hurdles that you have to get over along a theory of change. And so what we've learned is that if we want to show, just like the boat analogy said, if we want to show effectiveness, we have to show that our management processes are leading to our ultimate outcomes. So what we came up with, and I'm really glad that Edgar and others are on the phone, on the call, because of course this is adapted from work that they did in Peru and others. But our generic framework that our task force came up with was that for a site, we need to think about, do we have good governance in place? Do we have a well-designed site? And do we understand the context in which that site is working? We then have to do planning and management. And in particular, we need to do planning of what our interventions are going to be. And then we have to actually implement those interventions or strategies. And that's an iterative process. Based on that, then we want to think about our ultimate outcomes that we've defined in advance. And that could be that threats are mitigated. Also, in this day and age, we have to think about restoration needs being met. That leads to values being conserved, both natural and cultural, and that leads to human well-being being enhanced. And then, of course, there's some monitoring adaptation that has to take place both in the short and medium term, but also in the long term as we change our design and context. And all that leads to our ability to do national and global reporting. So at the highest level, these are the components of our generic framework: governance, design and context, planning and management, and ultimate outcomes. And then what we have is much more specific criteria. And then we even have more specific questions that we can ask to look at each of these elements of effectiveness. I don't have time to go into today, but I'll share with you the paper where this is published, and you can look at more detail of the elements of this framework. I will observe that some of them are enabling conditions, some of them are process steps, some of them are intermediate results, and some of them are ultimate outcomes. And interestingly, when you're assessing effectiveness, we have to take each of those types of elements and think about them differently, and also analyze them differently to really look at effectiveness. Okay, when we looked at all those existing frameworks and tools, like the MET, like the Green List, like the country plans, we found that they're pretty good at describing governance, design, and context. They generally cover how to think about planning and management. But there's some challenges in terms of how they actually thought about strategy implementation. And those existing frameworks and tools, they talk about outcomes, but they didn't really provide much guidance or support for how you actually track outcomes. And they also didn't do much about monitoring and adaptation. So what we did in our task force is we tried to fill some of those gaps. And in particular, in filling the strategy implementation gap, what we talked about was developing theories of change that show the common strategies or interventions that protected area systems tend to use. So for example, a lot of protected areas do enforcement. And if you're doing enforcement, the general theory of change says we're going to do enforcement activities. That's going to lead to having a good enforcement plan. The needed staff will be trained and deployed. If we do that, enforcement will be equitably implemented. If we do that, potential poachers will be deterred. If we do that, illegal threat activities will be reduced. And if we do that, our conservation values will be enhanced. And we can actually track and measure our progress along that theory of change. And so to measure our effectiveness and to show that our activities are leading to our outcomes, we can ask some questions of protected area systems of, when you're doing enforcement, are you seeing these results? And we can do that for other similar strategies that protected areas use, like maintaining their values, or like managing the legal harvest of products from the protected area, or doing education and outreach. So we can actually look and see, are the strategies delivering what they're supposed to do by using this theory of change approach. In a similar way, we're also filling the outcome tracking gap. And here, remember, we have to set the bar in advance and then measure our progress towards it. So we're borrowing from the conservation standards that I talked about before, where we can identify the values that represent the protected area or conserved area. So maybe a wetlands ecosystem, a rainforest, a mangrove, a jaguar population, a shark population. We identify those values in advance. We measure their status, ideally at the start of an evaluation interval. So maybe the wetlands were in poor shape, the rainforest was good, the mangroves were poor. We set the bar of where we want to get. So we want the wetlands to go from poor to fair. We want to keep the rainforest good. We want the mangrove to go from poor to very good. we want the jaguar to go from poor to fair. Over the interval, over a 5-year interval, you might not get the jaguar all the way to very good, but we're saying at least for this interval, let's try to get it to fair. At the end of the interval, we can then measure our status again. We can look at the trend, and we can say whether the outcome has been achieved. So in this case, we wanted to get from poor to fair. That outcome has not been achieved. Here, we want to get from poor to fair. We actually achieved the outcome. So we're giving managers useful information that they can say, where are things working, but where are we also having problems and maybe need to devote more attention? Okay, there's a lot more we could go into there, but for today's purposes, that's just a taste of some of the gaps that we're filling with our new framework. We then tested this framework with a whole bunch of different agencies and organizations. So we tested it with, for example, many of our colleagues at Red Parkus. And so here's people voting on this. We went to Tanzania and to South Africa and to Croatia and to Australia and to other Canada, and also tested the framework with protected area systems. So we got feedback and input into whether this framework was making sense. That's a little bit of an introduction to our framework for protected areas. So that's the first part of this presentation. Again, I'll show you at the end a report where you can get a lot more detail about that framework and what we learned. The really exciting thing, and I think the reason the hack has invited us to present today, is not just talking about individual protected areas, but what we really want to do is now talk about how we extend this framework to protected and conserved area systems. So I'm now going to introduce this new topic, and then we'll share some of the experiences from our colleagues in Peru and Colombia who have been working on this topic as well. So extending the framework to PCA systems. So this is that basic framework for thinking about a site. And the question is, does this framework also apply at a system level? So what we have thought about here is you can think about there's a PCA system. Again, that's the organization or agency or entity that is managing that network of sites. And they too can think about governance and design and planning and management at that system level. But in general, then, that governance, design, and planning and management is used to inform what happens down at the site level. So you're going to then set up the governance, design, and planning and management of the sites. That's going to lead to the outcomes at the site level. And then those outcomes will roll up to help us deliver the ultimate outcomes at the system level. And then there's a big question in this space. Are there also actions that systems can take at that higher level that directly deliver those outcomes? So it's this arrow here. Is that actually a factor as well and something that we need to consider? And so what we would like to do is, just like we tested all these elements of the framework at the site level, we would like to start thinking about how we might test and explore them at the system level. What we've also found is that the strategies here, the strategies that you would use at this level, are a little bit different than the strategies that you would use at the site level. So for example, what we might do is we might do individual and institutional capacity building. That leads to a good overall plan for capacity building. That leads to key management processes being improved. That leads to regulations being revised and adapted. That leads to capabilities linked to key processes and regulations being strengthened. That leads to the performance of the system improving. And that leads to the PA system achieving its outcomes. And then you can see here the indicators that you might measure to track that theory of change. So this is a theory of change for a system level action. That's the system level action of capacity building. Here's another one, which might be, do we need to increase the knowledge and information needed for management? So this is getting the information needed to manage that system. Again, you might have a plan to get that knowledge, a comprehensive information system for decision making. Information is added to the system over time. Key decision makers get timely information. They improve their decision making, and that again leads to the PAs and systems achieving their outcomes. So these are just theories of what we want to do at a system level. And what would be great is to test and see, do these actually work in real world systems? So I want to show you one more couple slides that explain how we can go from individual experience to the theory that the whole world can benefit from. So what we typically do in this case is we might implement a very specific action. So this is just an analogy. So our particular action in this case is, let's say we're working with a protected area in the Caribbean somewhere, and we care about turtles on the beach, and we care about the threat of illegal egg collecting. So we say our theory of change is that community guards are going to be set up to protect the beach. Effective guards will be deployed. Those guards can catch the egg collectors. Their presence deters other egg collectors from being there. It leads to illegal egg collecting being reduced. It leads to increased sea turtle nesting success. And in this case, we find that the patrols can safely confront the poachers because the poachers are just people's neighbors. And so the community guards are able to talk to their neighbors and keep them from coming to the beach. Let's go to another specific action in another part of the world. So now we're working in Africa on illegal pangolin poaching in a reserve, and we're going to set up community ranger patrols. And here, the theory of the change is kind of similar. Effective patrols are deployed. Those patrols will catch the poachers. Their presence will deter the poachers. Illegal pangolin poaching is reduced. We get to increase pangolin population. But in this case, the whole thing falls apart because we learn that the poachers are not people's neighbors, but they're actually drug gangs armed with AK-47s, and they literally blow the community ranger patrols away. So the answer is, never does an intervention work everywhere. It's always going to work in some places and not in others. And if we implement that intervention and study it in 4 or 5 or 10 different places, we'll learn about the conditions where it works and where it doesn't work. And in that case, we can create a generic theory of change that talks about the conditions of where that strategy works and doesn't work. So that's why we like theories of change, because we can iterate between the specific and the generic actions. So we can take data and information from case studies and synthesize them, and then use that information to inform ongoing practice. So when I showed you these chains here, these are generic chains that we're working on. We want to test in different cases in different countries to see, do these work at a system level? Are these what system managers care about? And then we can learn about how to improve these chains over time. So that's some of the thinking that we would like to do at a system level. To demonstrate that process and to start thinking about it, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Paola, who's going to introduce our 2 speakers from Peru and from Colombia who have been thinking about this work. So maybe over to you, Paola. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Nick. And good morning, buenos dias, good afternoon, good evening, those that are in a different time zone. It's really a great honor to introduce 2 government representatives from Colombia and Peru who will share their experience, but also the voice of a group that for over a decade has been working to strengthen how we understand and assess effectiveness of protected area systems across Latin America. I don't see Edgar yet. I'm not sure whether something came up and he won't join, but I hope he will be able to join us soon. Just briefly, before Marta starts with her presentation, a little bit of history about the group. This group, the Adaptive Management or Effectiveness Group, brings together colleagues from protected area systems over Latin American countries. Felipe is also here from IUCN Brazil. The group shares one conviction, which is that effectiveness is not only about management processes, but about achieving meaningful results and impacts for biodiversity and people. Right now, there are 8 countries in the group. And just to tell a little bit more, this group started to work in 2013. They have been collaborating through different regional workshops, exchanges, identifying practical solutions to their challenges within their national systems. And well, this helped to, it seems, they say that this helped to strengthen and we are going to see examples of that, and find concrete solutions to implement adaptive management, to improve the assessment of effectiveness, and to move towards an outcome-based approach to protect their effectiveness. And just to share maybe the connection of this group with this work of the WCPA that we have been doing. So over the years, this group has made progress and generated some important conceptual documents. As an example, in 2019, the group had reached a common understanding and an agreement that effectiveness must be measured, as I said, through the achievement of results and impacts. And this collective position was captured in a document that the group calls the Lima Message. And in 2024, the group also generated a draft document on what it means in practice to move towards an outcome-based approach to assess protected effectiveness. And all this thinking, documents generated by this group, having key inputs to the work that we have been doing in the WCPA. So I would really like to emphasize that it's not only like testing the work that we have been doing, but the thinking and the experience of the group has informed the work of the WCPA. And just to share the message that's why I think it's key to continue working with the same approach. So it would be great if we can move forward to really focus on generating a document as WCPA, focus on the system level. That the one that we have generated as WCPA right now is kind of a conceptual document, but it's more applicable maybe for the PA level. So it would be great to work with all of you in that challenge. So yes, we are very pleased to have these two members, as I said, Marta from Parques Colombia and Edgar. Marta will begin with a conceptual introduction to the assessment of protected area system effectiveness, with also sharing briefly the progress in Colombia. So Marta, with that, I think that we are ready. ¿Tú quieres compartir pantalla o comparto yo? ¿Cómo vamos a hacer?
Good morning, everyone. Si quieres compartir pantalla, por favor, porque
Sí,
tengo muy mal,
claro.
tengo muy mal internet,
Sí.
incluso se me ha ido un par de veces
Lo sé.
en la
Tranquila.
reunión. Entonces, ¿se está escuchando bien?
Sí, sí.
Ok. Bueno, me disculpan, por favor, no voy a prender cámara porque tengo muy mal internet. No sé si esté transmitiendo bien. Bueno, quiero compartir con ustedes los avances que tenemos en el tema de efectividad de áreas protegidas en el nivel de sistema de áreas protegidas en Colombia. Siguiente, por favor, Paola. Paola, adelante.
Ya tengo la siguiente, Marta. Tal vez está demorado.
Ok. Bueno, inicialmente, pues, digamos, para ponernos a tono lo que es un sistema, digamos, en términos de que es un conjunto de elementos interrelacionados y organizados que interactúan para obtener un objetivo común. Puede ser muy sencilla la definición, pero entendemos que hay una serie de elementos que tienen que interactuar, que relacionarse para poder resultar funcionales en términos del objetivo que se pretende alcanzar. Siguiente, por favor. En ese sentido, entendemos que el propósito de un sistema de áreas protegidas, más allá, digamos, de los objetivos que tiene cada una de las áreas protegidas, que bien lo ha explicado Nick, con todo lo que implica el alcanzar los objetivos de conservación de un área protegida, es cómo actuamos como sistema para poder alcanzar unos propósitos comunes. Es necesario entonces articular acciones en diferentes escalas para generar unos resultados de conservación que no se lograrían independientemente. Es decir, a pesar de que cada área puede alcanzar sus objetivos de conservación, necesitamos alcanzar un propósito común. Para esto necesitamos entender que se debe representar adecuadamente la biodiversidad, mantener una conectividad ecológica, coordinar acciones entre actores y contribuir al bienestar de la sociedad. Entonces, esa efectividad se mide como la capacidad del conjunto, de un conjunto de áreas para integralmente alcanzar los objetivos de conservación de un sistema de áreas protegidas. Siguiente, por favor.
Perdón que te interrumpo, Marta. Isidoro, creo que Isidoro, it seems that the translation is not working, and people, I'm not sorry, I'm not sure if you saw that in the chat.
Yes, I'm troubleshooting right now with the engineers to see what's going on in the back end. But you can also follow the transcription on the link I sent. You can follow the conversation while it's not being the audio is not being outputted in English. You can follow the text. For now, we'll likely solve it in the next few minutes.
Okay, so everyone already, okay, so that seems is working. Okay, perfect. Marta, perdón, pero ahora sí.
Adelante, Paola. Siguiente, si nos hace el favor. En Colombia tenemos en términos de sistema una complejidad, digamos, en la gestión de la conservación, porque tenemos áreas protegidas que están configuradas de diferentes categorías y actuamos tanto como subsistemas, regionalmente, digamos, geográficamente vienen configurados unos subsistemas y además temáticamente, digamos, o por ciertas áreas geográficas. Entonces implica que nos tengamos que organizar para saber cómo evaluar la efectividad en términos de esas escalas de conservación, entendiendo, por ejemplo, que tenemos un sistema nacional de áreas protegidas con diferentes escalas de ámbito público y de ámbito privado, que requerimos avanzar para saber cómo estamos en términos del cumplimiento de los objetivos de conservación y del impacto que tenemos en términos de conservación de la biodiversidad y del bienestar de la sociedad. Adelante, por favor. Entonces, para abordar todo lo que es la gestión de las áreas protegidas en las que estamos rondando pues por 1.800 áreas protegidas en todo el país, se generó a nivel país una política que es el COMPES 4050 con un objetivo general, ¿sí?, que es reducir al 2030 el riesgo de pérdida de naturaleza en el Sistema Nacional de Áreas Protegidas, con el fin de garantizar la protección de la biodiversidad y los servicios ecosistémicos que soportan el desarrollo social, económico y cultural de la nación. Para nosotros es un gran avance el hecho de que tengamos un objetivo como sistemas de áreas protegidas y que sea una política de Estado. Eso nos ha permitido avanzar, digamos, en términos de cómo incide la conservación de las diferentes áreas protegidas a diferentes escalas de país. Aquí entonces los objetivos específicos de esa política COMPES es tener un sistema representativo ecológicamente que esté bien conectado, que esté equitativamente gestionado, pero también que esté efectivamente gestionado. Es decir, que esa implementación de políticas, planes y programas por parte de los actores sociales y de todos los actores institucionales que interactúan cuenten no solamente con un marco normativo adecuado, que es una condición habilitante, sino también de una gestión de conocimiento y una sostenibilidad financiera que sea soporte operativo y que permita ese soporte técnico en términos de la gestión de áreas protegidas en el país. Adelante, Paola. En esto, pues, por supuesto, en este sistema multiescalar tenemos retos en esa medición de la efectividad, dado que, como les comentaba, tenemos un sistema nacional de áreas protegidas que a su vez cobija unos sistemas de áreas regionales, subsistemas regionales de áreas protegidas, y ese a su vez actúa o gestiona unos subsistemas temáticos y unas áreas protegidas. Siguiente, por favor. Entonces, esa efectividad multiescalar, digamos que no se analiza, digamos, de la misma forma que la efectividad de las áreas protegidas. Un poco tratando de revisar esa historia completa que nos contaba Nick, se requiere analizar esas condiciones habilitantes y aspectos estructurales permanentes que inciden en lo que es la gestión como sistema. Y por otro lado, valorar ese nivel de cumplimiento de la apuesta de país, en este caso, una apuesta de conservación a partir del cómo y entre quiénes se realiza. Es decir, ver no solamente la historia completa, sino quiénes la componen, cuáles son esas condiciones que habilitan o no la conservación, entre quiénes la estamos desarrollando y en dónde. Esto es fundamental para poder avanzar en ese análisis de efectividad a escala de sistema con todas sus complejidades, como es el caso que tenemos en Colombia. Adelante. Hemos avanzado, digamos, ya históricamente en Colombia tratando de revisar estas diferentes escalas de trabajo en términos de áreas protegidas y, digamos, tratando de implementar metodologías para estos niveles, tanto de sistema como de subsistema, de manera que hemos evaluado la acción de las áreas protegidas a nivel de bioma, también a nivel, por ejemplo, de áreas protegidas que comparten una condición fronteriza, ¿cierto? O sistemas regionales y subsistemas de áreas protegidas con unas metodologías diseñadas específicamente para estos contextos en términos de la planeación, de sus recursos, de sus procesos, de los efectos en la gestión. Y a partir de estas experiencias se reconoce pues la práctica tanto de oportunidades como de falencias en la gestión. Esto ha sido pues digamos históricamente lo que hemos tratado de implementar para avanzar en lo que es la efectividad de la conservación a nivel multiescalar. Siguiente, por favor. En ese sentido, pues hemos avanzado en un proceso metodológico que en este momento se está implementando, no tenemos aún los resultados, pero hemos venido incorporando pues los principios y las prácticas que hemos desarrollado a través de Red Parques específicamente, y con todas estas experiencias que les he comentado de los diferentes análisis que hemos hecho a nivel multiescalar internamente en el país. En ese sentido, hemos identificado varios componentes, como es la finalidad de ese sistema que analiza la integración de los objetivos de conservación de país y del área dentro de ese sistema. Revisando también cómo es esa gobernanza, contemplando las interacciones entre esas estructuras, procesos y tradiciones que determinan cómo es ejercido el poder, las responsabilidades, la forma como se toman las decisiones y cómo escuchamos la voz de los diferentes interesados en la conservación y en las personas pues, que pueden llegar a tener incluso algún conflicto con las áreas protegidas. ¿Y cómo es esa condición? Es decir, el estado general del sistema con respecto a los diferentes atributos. Aquí entonces el componente, vemos los objetivos, la finalidad del sistema, vemos los objetivos de conservación, los beneficios de la naturaleza. En el de buena gobernanza evaluamos entonces ese eje de diseño y funcionalidad, de planificación, recursos y ordenamiento, la gestión del conocimiento, por supuesto, como los diferentes ejes esa gobernanza. Y en el componente de condición vemos qué tan representativo es ese sistema, qué tan bien conectado está ese ecosistema y qué tan equitativamente está siendo manejado. Esto entonces vemos cómo lo unimos allí con esos principios y prácticas que hemos venido trabajando con Red Parques, a través de ver cómo las áreas protegidas públicas hacen su análisis de efectividad del manejo, ¿cierto? Cómo se identifican las brechas y las necesidades de mejoramiento en esas prácticas, cómo avanzamos en lo que es la capacidad, fortaleciendo las capacidades de los manejadores de áreas protegidas con el fin de alcanzar los objetivos de conservación deseados en las áreas protegidas. Por supuesto, la idea es generar más confianza en la sociedad y que podamos documentar esos éxitos y esos avances y esos retos en lo que es ya alcanzar pues, las metas de 30 por 30. En esto entonces pues vamos avanzando en la metodología de evaluación de efectividad del sistema, siempre basada en un monitoreo. Para nosotros es importante poder controlar cómo vamos, y nosotros implementamos a nivel de área en diferentes temporalidades. A nivel de sistema, como les comento, vamos avanzando. Ya hemos implementado a nivel de diferentes escalas, pero en este momento lo estamos proyectando ya para nivel de sistema. Y, por supuesto, vinculando los procesos de gestión a través de estrategias con estos resultados intermedios que hemos obtenido, pero esperamos trabajar a nivel de impacto, que es lo más importante, digamos, en términos de los 4 objetivos específicos de nuestra política de conservación de país, el COMPES 40-50. Siguiente, por favor. En este sentido, entonces, pues hemos venido incorporando estos enfoques para mejorar las herramientas existentes en varios aspectos. Tenemos, por ejemplo, avanzando en gobernanza y equidad, tratando de trabajar una gobernanza multinivel, integrando los diferentes actores, tanto a nivel local como a nivel regional y nacional. Analizando también de qué manera estamos trabajando la equidad en los beneficios, en la distribución justa y equitativa de los costos de la conservación y de sus beneficios, promoviendo el bienestar de las comunidades locales. Vemos también una adaptabilidad, es decir, una visión de conjunto que nos permita entender ese sistema nacional de áreas protegidas como un todo funcional, no como islas, sino con temas pues, de cómo hay una integración en temas de gestión y de conectividad y de beneficios a nivel de diferentes escalas. Resultados y conectividad, evaluamos, tratamos pues de que se evalúe el impacto real del sistema en el cumplimiento de los objetivos de conservación de país. Y cómo avanzamos en la conectividad biológica a partir de corredores y flujos ecológicos en términos de su funcionamiento para sostener especies y servicios ecosistémicos. Vemos cómo optimizamos los recursos, identificando fortalezas y debilidades comunes, permitiendo una inversión más eficiente del presupuesto y del talento humano a escala regional. Revisamos también esa comprensión territorial, es decir, cómo influyen las dinámicas, las políticas económicas y todo lo que es la cultura en términos del éxito de la conservación. Y un enfoque holístico que supera el análisis individual por área protegida, tratando de integrar actores, revisando y fortaleciendo la gobernanza, viendo cómo estamos en conectividad y gestión compartida en un solo diagnóstico. Y el cumplimiento de los compromisos en términos de que es una herramienta clave para responder a las políticas de Estado y con los acuerdos globales, por supuesto, hablando, por ejemplo, del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica y las metas Cumming-Montreal. Siguiente, por favor. Y finalmente, pues revisar por qué la efectividad analiza por qué un sistema de áreas protegidas logra o no logra sus objetivos de conservación. Para esto, pues vemos que es necesario analizar el contexto de la gestión del sistema, ¿cierto? Verificando sus condiciones habilitantes, sus aspectos estructurales, el grado de cumplimiento de los objetivos de conservación. Allí, pues, lo que pretendemos es avanzar para revisar cómo está la gobernanza, cómo está la coordinación entre actores, la planificación, el financiamiento y la gestión, para ver qué hay que adaptar, cómo es esa gestión adaptativa que nos permite avanzar en el logro de los resultados de conservación del sistema. Es decir, tenemos que verlo como un todo, es decir, no solamente un área por área, no solamente subsistema por subsistema, sino en el marco de los resultados que vamos obteniendo en estas escalas, vamos a analizar el contexto de gestión del sistema como un todo, con esas condiciones. Y, por supuesto, conocer el impacto de la protección, que es, digamos, necesitamos evaluar esa capacidad que tenemos para cumplir un propósito común, ¿cierto? Que es conservar la biodiversidad, mantener esos procesos ecológicos y generar beneficios duraderos para la sociedad. Y allí, por supuesto, vincular esos procesos de gestión, esos esfuerzos a través de estrategias en donde podamos medir los resultados intermedios y finales de la conservación. Estos, pues, como unos mensajes claves en temas de los análisis de efectividad de un sistema de áreas protegidas y cómo hemos venido incorporando los procesos, los principios y los avances que tenemos a nivel de la red parques para la efectividad de los sistemas de áreas protegidas. Siguiente, por favor, creo que ya aquí terminamos nuestra presentación y pues muy atentos también a las inquietudes. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Marta. Thank you, Marta. And I think that I didn't say, but Marta is the Deputy Director of Protected Area Management at Parques Naturales Colombia. So, Isidoro, I guess that we have some moment for questions and answers.
Paola, we should probably hold the questions for the end.
Okay. And I haven't seen Edgar with us. He's not right. I don't see him. Edgar? Okay, it seems that Edgar, although he sent me a message that he was joining, I'm not sure what happened right now. Okay, so Nick, maybe we can continue with Sabi then.
Okay. All right, thank you, Paola. All right, so we have heard, let me come back on video. So we have heard from one of the countries, and I think that helps us show how we are thinking about applying this framework at a system level. One of the things that we've learned is that if we do this, we actually then want the information to be available to system managers and to be useful. And so that leads us into how do we take the results of these effectiveness assessments and present them in a way that managers can use and make sense of them? And what this actually could eventually lead to is the creation of system-level dashboards that give managers the information that they need and want to think about. And so to inspire you a little bit here, I want to introduce this concept of dashboards, and then I'm going to turn to my Foundations of Success colleague, Xavi, to give you an example of a dashboard that's being developed for some work in Madagascar as an example of what we could potentially do together going forward to make use of this information. So let me share my screen real quickly here again. Get to more. I'm going to share my screen, come back to this presentation. Okay, so creating system dashboards. To give you a little context for what we mean by dashboard and what makes a dashboard useful, think about a car you might be driving. And your car has literally a dashboard with a bunch of gauges on it. So for example, there's a fuel gauge. And what makes that fuel gauge useful? And I would submit to you it's three things. The first is that there's an information need. So there's some decision that we're making based on this gauge. In this case, when do we pull over and get fuel? There's an actual measurement. So there's a needle that corresponds to the amount of liquid that's in your fuel tank. And that's the indicator. And everybody worries about the indicator. But what really makes this gauge useful is not just the indicator, but it's the markings underneath that help you interpret what that indicator is telling you. If you just had this needle without any markings, it wouldn't mean anything. And so we really have to understand not just the indicator, but what does the indicator mean in context and how does it help us make the decision? And the thing about this is it doesn't really matter if we had about 4 liters of fuel or we had 3.9872641 liters of fuel. We're not going to make a different decision. So it doesn't have to be super precise, but it does have to be accurate so that when it's getting close to empty, we know what to do. And if we get smarter over time, we can convert this indicator or this gauge into something that's even more useful to managers. What happens though is in cars and in dashboards, we often build something like this, which is if you're driving a race car is useful because it will tell you when you're going to burn out your engine. But if you're driving an ordinary automatic car, or even if you drive a stick shift, most of us do that by ear, then this tachometer is actually not giving you any information that you need to make a decision. And so it's a waste of time and space. And so when we build dashboards, we want to build useful gauges that help managers make decisions. And so with that, I would like to introduce my colleague Xavi, who's going to walk us through examples of some dashboards that he's been involved in working on. So Xavi, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Hi, everyone. So what I bring here is just one example. Doesn't meaning that it's perfect. It's something that it's a work in progress, and it's a collaboration we're doing with a foundation, a trust fund in Madagascar called Foundations for the Protected Areas and Biodiversity Madagascar. It's a funding mechanism, so it's not a protected area manager. It's not a agency that runs a network of protected areas, but it's a mechanism that it's supporting a big proportion of the protected areas that exist in Madagascar. They've got different decisions they need to make, and they first, and maybe we can move on, Nick, to the first one. They first invested a bit of time developing their cadre stratégique, or the frame of intervention that explains how the type of support, financial support they provide to protected areas, it's supposed to help the final outcome, that it's better conservation of biodiversity in the country, and all the rest that derive from that. So there's this theory of change here in screen that shows how the financing they give to some protected areas is supposed to support these protected areas in doing their job. And assuming that they do their job and are well and effectively managed, they will help reduce the threats that are affecting biodiversity in these areas. Then biodiversity will be better, and this will lead to human well-being of the communities living around the protected areas will be also better off. That's the logic of intervention as a financial mechanism supporting protected areas, but they also worry and are interested and realize that protected areas on their own don't work. So they need what they call buffer areas surrounding it, or working with these protected areas where communities manage and use resources so that that takes out pressure from the protected areas and the values they want to preserve. So that's the line below. They're also interested in understanding how these community managed areas are managed. Are they effectively managed? Are they sufficiently funded? Are they playing the role in this work together with protected areas, so biodiversity can be better off? And finally, as a funding mechanism that is supporting mostly protected areas, they are really worried about if the protected areas are on the right places, are protecting the right spots, are protecting the right patches of habitat and the right remnants of species in a country like Madagascar with huge pressures, as you probably know. So they are worried about representativity, ecological connectivity, and also trying to identify if there's any decisions there that are leading to suggesting and making advocacy work, or trying to convince to get the expansion of current areas, or the declaration of new protected areas. And they're worried about this because they've got a board and they've got a community that lives around them. They've got donors that put money in this trust fund that want to know if this support is making a difference or not. So that's a bit the context that justifies the investment in developing this dashboard to help understand finally if this is working or not working. So if we can move to the next one, you can see a selection, a few of the management questions they are trying to address through the visualizations that this dashboard includes. The main one is our funding having an impact? Are we really contributing to an improvement in biodiversity? And are we actually doing this compared to what is happening outside of protected areas? And that's an interesting, and I think that makes a sense based on what we were hearing before from Colombia and Marta, what's happening with our support compared to the rest. The same for threats, the same for local communities. Is it true that they are benefiting or not from the existence of these protected areas? And as I was saying, are they well placed? Are they ecologically connected? And if we move to the next slide, also they are interested in understanding if these protected areas are well funded or how much resources do protected areas in the country need, so they can decide which protected areas they can support with the resources they can manage. If they need to fundraise, how much do they want to finance each protected area, how deep the financing needs to go in order to get the impact. There's other players as well in the ecosystem in Madagascar. As well, are the protected areas effectively managed? Not to judge anybody, but just to identify where they can support and how they can support them in a better way. Are there patterns across the protected areas we support? Do they usually stumble with the same things? Can we develop approaches that are on a bulk base addressing a common problem across protected areas? And then there's other questions about community managed areas, and there's a lack of data on that. And that's also something I want to reiterate. It's complex to convert this framework into reality. Data is not always available. Usually we tend to think, or they tend to think at FAPBM, that protected area managers will tell them, but that not always works. So that's why they look for different data sources that all adding up, helps them get smarter about the situation in the country and make smarter decisions on the way they deploy the support and the funding for protected areas. So if we can move to the next slide, we can see some examples of the visualizations. But before that, let me say that all these questions, that's also a realization. I think that also speaks to what Marta was saying. These questions are hard to answer at the national level, because when you ask yourself, is this working? And you're thinking about a protected area with mangroves, the answer will be completely different when you compare that answer to a spiny thicket habitat protected area or a rainforest. So that's why they decided they needed to kind of slice the country in what they call ecoregions, based in work done by experts back in the days like Moldon, Goodman. Also WWF did a lot of work in defining the ecoregions present in the country. And they adapted that to a level of detail that makes sense for a donor mechanism, for a funding mechanism in the country. So again, they are not trying to understand every single detail. They're just trying to understand a level of detail that is sufficient for them for the type of decisions they need to make. So they are working in these ecoregions that are defined here. And now, yes, if we move to the next one, we can see one example. And they had to choose. They can measure a lot of things, but then they need to find the balance between data being available, data that is useful to answer the questions that we need to answer, and data that we can sustain over time, that it's being updated. And in this case, I'm showing a data set from Hansen, Global Forest Watch, available to everybody, being updated regularly. And this is used, again, is not telling the whole story, but at least it's more than what they had before, where they can compare and answer some questions. For example, what happens, and maybe you can see in the matrix down on the lower part of the screen, you see FAPBM protected areas. There's the column there where they can see how much of the protected areas in percentual in this ecoregion are losing compared to protected areas they still don't finance, they don't support. And what happens compared to the areas outside protected areas, that's the column on the right. And that already gives them some information. First, which ecoregion is performing better than others percentually, and then there's other visualizations where you can see the actual number of hectares being lost on the last 5 years, on the last year, and this helps them prioritize. If we move to the next slide, this also provides details on which protected areas are losing the most compared to the others. So that points out clearly which protected areas I need to talk to in order to repurpose the funding that we are deploying to ensure that we're getting the impact we want, that it's, in this case, less deforestation. Or it also points out to the next protected area that I may be considering funding because they are the ones that are having the biggest problem. This is just an example. If we move to the next slide, we see another aspect of this data set from Global Forest Watch, the drivers of deforestation. These can also be sliced by ecoregions. And if we click one more, Nick, we can see and probably if you know Madagascar, wildfires or forest fires is the main cause of forest loss in the country. So that also informs the type of funding, the type of grants, the type of priorities that they set up when they decide on a yearly basis what's the type of support we're going to prioritize when we work in protected areas. You can also look at that. Dry forests, spiny thickets are the most affected by this, but also rainforest is affected by this. The good part of this data set is that it's independent of what protected areas are telling us, which is good and bad. We always need to double check this satellite information we need to ground truth it, but at least it gives them a framework to start addressing this question, is our funding making an impact or not? And just to finish another section, if we can move forward, they also want to know if protected areas are well managed or effectively managed or not. And this is a very simplified approach that works for a financing mechanism. They look at different components of what they build up as this management effectiveness indicator or section. At the right-hand side on the matrix, you see MET. They are using the MET values each protected area manager self-reports because that's the standard across the country. That's what the ministry asks for, and that helps them understand where the protected areas see themselves. But there's a column next to it called in French SOS, which stands for Environmental and Social Safeguards. And if you click one more, Nick, in this, there's a selection of criteria related to the compliance of these ESG criteria that they try to see if there are patterns across protected areas. For example, if we would be able to access the actual tool, we would see that as we scroll down the protected areas, we see always these conflict resolution systems are typically not in place across the country. So that's also a idea where they can work and try to support protected areas so they get better at complying with environmental and social safeguards. There's other components. Maybe we can click one more, Nick, and we see there's this other column called about administrative integrity. And from a funding mechanism, again, not everything under the sun, but just trying to spot some flashing red lights that if they see them in a protected area, maybe they have problems the way they submit the reports. Maybe they are asking very often what they call requests for non-objection to changes on the plan that are, again, not the truth, but at least some indicators, some proxy indicators that point out that this team managing this protected area may be needing a certain type of support to address and to ensure that they are ready and set to deliver the work they need to deliver that leads to better conservation. And just a final slide, there's another example on the audit risk. This is another component that they measure and they need for transparency's sake. And if they identify, and this is something they've been doing for several years, that's why they've got more information. So they can also monitor another set of these flashing lights on the sense Nick was pointing out that is telling you that something is not going as it should at the protected area. Again, not to judge anything, but just to spot where we can help and what should be the questions that we need to ask the protected area managers. And I'm going to stop here. There's a lot more that we could discuss about this example. I hope that it's helpful and inspiring, and maybe there's some time for questions at the end. Nick, back to you.
Thank you, Xavi. So we are getting to the next steps in discussion bit here. So what we're going to show here is one of the things that we talked about with Isadora and the hack folks is that one thing we could do together would be to do a a high-level sprint training course. So we could spend maybe 5 or 6 sessions working together, looking in more detail at each of these different components, at the governance and design, at the planning and the management, at the outcomes for threats and values. And we could actually see and work together to see how we think these components in this framework might apply at a system level. And we could explore some of those theories of change that I showed you, and we could test them in different places and see where they work. So we could do some work together over a few sessions if it makes sense to folks to really go through and learn about each of these components. We could kind of present the idea and then test it and apply it in your particular situation. So this is one idea of something we could do together. I think drawing on what Xavi presented, it might be some real interest in could countries get together and build or exchange information about different dashboards that might be useful as system managers. What would you need? What would make sense? Could we build on the experience of Madagascar? We've done similar work in Mongolia, other places as well. So how could we learn from each other? And maybe not everybody has to build a dashboard from scratch, but we could actually work together and adapt the existing ones and then customize them for countries. So there's a lot of potential that I think with the hack group could really take on here. It's up to you all to decide what would be useful and what would be helpful. So my last slide here is basically, if you want more information, this is the framework that we've produced. You can either use this QR code or you can just go to Issues Paper Series number 9. Just look up WCPA Issues Paper Series number 9. It'll take you to this link. And eventually, maybe what we could do together, part of my dream here is that we could then take and do a new version of this paper that would actually look about applying it to systems level. And maybe you could participate and be part of the group that would help us pull together this next version of it. So that's a lot in a hurry. I'll also put my email up here, mine and Paula's email. I'll type them up here so that you all can reach us. I should have done that before, but it's, and then I'm going to turn it over to Isidoro, who's going to talk about the questions, and also he has a couple poll questions that he would like to run to you. So you want to take us through that, Isidoro?
Yes, thank you, Nick. So as you might have noted, I've launched a poll. Again, this is central to the question surrounding how do we get practitioners from the hack countries and also other stakeholders engaged in a longer series of learning and capacity building. And of course, FOS is such a great partner, and we hope to build on this session to continue developing this effectiveness and outcomes discussion centering at the systems as well as polity ministerial level, since most of the focal points at the hack are at the ministry level and system level. And therefore, I think it would be of great benefit to the network to coalesce and engage in thinking through what does effectiveness mean at this more higher level. So I've put in a couple poll questions as well with following through with the invitation that Nick presented of supporting and working together on this IUCN WCPA systems level technical note or document, or I think it'll be, again, really exciting. It is something that hasn't been done thoroughly, and I think it will greatly benefit the community. So I'll give you 3 more minutes to answer this. I don't have elevator music or anything while you guys think through, but I'm going to put myself on mute for a minute or two. And I hope, hope this is something exciting that folks are interested in building on.
Isidore, in the meantime, if people want to ask questions, either raise their hand or put stuff in the chat. We could also start to take questions or discussion.
Yes, certainly. We can open up to questions since we have about 10 more minutes left.
Bonaventure, you have a
Yes.
question?
Oui, merci. Vous m'entendez? Vous m'entendez?
Oui?
OK. Pourrait s'appliquer aux autres outils d'évaluation de l'efficacité de gestion, ou bien est-ce que c'est intégré dans le cadre SMAP, le cadre mondial pour les 6 cadres? En quoi je voulais savoir comment, parce que il me semble que c'est nouveau, le concept de théorie du changement. Merci.
So I didn't understand the French. I don't have the English. Xavi, did you maybe answer that one?
Yeah, Nick, if I got it right, Bonaventura was asking about how this idea of the theory of change integrates in the overall framework that it's out there. And it seems to be something new. C'est pas, Bonaventura, je ne sais pas si tu as posé ces questions pour comprendre comment se connecte cet outil, la théorie des changements, avec les cadres qui existent. C'était la question?
Oui, vraiment, oui, c'est ça.
Okay,
Okay.
that makes
C'est bien
sense.
ça.
Yeah, merci.
Merci.
So the answer is that our goal with our framework was not to create a new framework. There's enough existing frameworks and tools that are out there, but our goal was to understand what makes for a good framework and then to work with the managers of existing frameworks and tools to incorporate those principles and practices into their work. So, for example, we spent a couple years working with the Green List. And if you know, the Green List has gone from version 1 to version 2 of the Green List standard, and they've created a self-assessment tool. And a lot of the principles and practices that we developed have now been baked into the Green List. Or various countries, like as we saw from Colombia and also from Peru, they're changing their own frameworks that they're using, but they're incorporating these principles and practices. So our idea is not to, again, create a new version, but we recognize that countries are going to use the framework or tool that they want to use, but we can help make those tools better. And part of what we'd like to do is explore doing that at a system level as well. Other questions?
Maybe I would like to add something because I think, if I am not wrong, that Buenaventura was also asking about how the theory of change idea is integrated with this thing of effectiveness assessment. Sabi, am I right?
Yes, but I would say
Yes,
that
so I would like to add that one of the things that we learned when we did the crosswalk analysis of different frameworks and tools is that one of the gaps is that sometimes things are not integrated. So, for example, sometimes people assess, let's say, governance or capacity or implementation, but in an isolated way. So one of the key things is really to try to tell the complete story and tell how having a good governance and having good capacities help to implement strategies and to achieve outcomes. And there is where the thing of the theory of change is so important, because it's helping to tell this story, help to integrate things, help to, yes, tell these assumptions. How is that with what we do, we achieve our outcomes? Is something that sometimes is not so common in some of the frameworks or tools. So it's something I would say it's one of the added value of this approach, or one of the key features.
Other questions? Donald.
Yes, thank you, Nick. I have a question still related to the theory of change. I want to know, how can theory of change be applied to a system that is constant? I take an example. you have a protected area. No, you have a space that has value and that you want to protect. And that space is now be gazetted as protected area. And you put your objective, you fix your objectives, and you make management so that the value should be constant there. So how can you apply theory of change in that case? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. So I think you can do it at two different levels. One is at the level of the overall theory of change for protected areas. So you have to have those components. It would help you think, do I have governance in place? Do I have good design? Am I coming up with my strategy? So you can use that theory of change as sort of a template to see whether you have the right components and elements. And then within the strategies, as I showed you, you might be doing uh, patrolling and protection. You might be doing education. And so for each of those strategies that the managers are using, they can use a theory of change to see whether they're doing the right actions, whether they're seeing the results they're expecting to see, and then if they're not, what can they do to fix it and change it and be adaptively managing? So a theory of change is really just the logic of what you think you want to be doing. That's why it's called a theory, but you have to test that theory with reality to see if it's actually working, and that's how you learn and improve. Okay. All right. Isidore, I think we're getting to the bottom of the hour, so maybe I will turn it back over to you to close us up, and then we can think about next steps.
Wonderful, Nick. Thank you so much. Salud. Just to flag that we will be sharing this material after this meeting ends, and we'll be posting it on our social media channels as well for folks that weren't able to attend during the session. So with that in mind, I would like to thank our speakers for this really engaging discussion, really timely conversation surrounding systems level conservation outcomes and effectiveness. On behalf of the HAC, we would thank you. We'd like to thank you for your engagement and support on this, as well as the participants for the great questions. Again, the HAC has a busy agenda coming up in the next few weeks. We'll be at SUPSTA. So if you'll be there, we will be there doing some capacity building engagements, and we have upcoming webinars, not as in terms of of course, this is the start of a learning trajectory for us. We have a couple of online meetings, for example, the next IPLC task force meeting coming up on the sidelines of SUPSA, discussing on SBHA and other relevant topics for Indigenous peoples and local communities. And with that in mind, and taking with consideration on everyone's time, thank you again. And you will be hearing from the HAC and FOS shortly. I'm ending the poll. And if you're looking forward to engaging and weren't able to respond before the end of the session, we'll be sending another opportunity to engage with this process. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day.